Thank you very much. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. Well done. I'm happy to be back a second time around. David Wilkins, I'm alumni from North Carolina. This is my wife, Shelby. And like Ron, Mr. Thunder, and his wife, we're doing this for the first time on stage, so we've been practicing it for a little while, so I think we'll do all right. But this issue of disenrollment, banishment, we put that under this broader concept of dismemberment. And you're next going to hear from, after Shelley's presentation, you'll hear from Gabe. I met Gabe a couple years ago after learning about his work through a disenrollee who had told me about his work, how his was the only Indian law firm that was willing to represent them as a tribe down in California. And so Shelley and I drove up one day and met him in Seattle, had lunch with him and Ryan, and we've been fighting this battle together ever since. I go back to 1996 when I first learned of the issue of banishment, when my best friend, who was a Monacan Indian from Virginia, was banished by his tribe in that state for having allegedly committed religious treason because he was trying to teach Native youth in the tribe about traditional ways, and the tribal leadership was all Christian, and there was that theological religious conflict. That same year, a federal court in New York State handed down a decision, Poudre versus the Tonawanda Band of Seneca, in which 5 Seneca members had been banished for having allegedly committed treason against the tribe because they were raising questions about the tribe's direction. And as Vine Delore had always taught me, he said, Wilkins, whenever you see a trend in something, start a file. And then when you have enough information, write it up. And so I began to do that. And I began to research the topic and was seeing that banishments were popping up in different places. And some of those examples are laid out in the book. And Vine was still active at the time, and he and I talked about it quite a bit. And so there was I want to read a couple of quotes from him that really sort of set the stage for me, and as well as for everything that he stood for and what I think we're about as a community represented here. He wrote a short piece in 1974 in which he said, "The gut question has to do with the meaning of the tribe. Should it continue to be a quasi-political entity? Should it become primarily an economic structure? Or should it become once again a religious community? The future, perhaps the immediate future, will tell." Right? And I think in a lot of what we've been hearing yesterday and today is about that very question. Who are we? How do we define ourselves? What is our relationship to one another, our relationship to the land and to the waterways and to all the species, all the different entities that constitute this land and this earth that we live on. And so that kept me sort of driving toward wanting to know more. And of course, Vine was always sort of one step ahead of most of us. And he then made a statement that also resonated with me. And this was an article he wrote in 1977. And this is long before gaming, right? This is long before the big money that some tribes are pulling in today. And here's what he said. He said, "The Indian exclusivity stance is very peculiar. Indians, their eyes on college scholarships, oil royalties, and special privileges, have taken the reverse attack, eliminating peoples unjustly from participation in the affairs of their communities." So he was already seeing that some tribes were beginning to cast out or push away individuals who they saw as dissidents or as raising questions that political elites in any country found uncomfortable. So like I say, he was always one step ahead of us. But as I continued to learn and continue to see examples of banishment, and then issues of disenrollment began to pop up and began to spread. As gaming took hold in any country and began to produce vast chunks of money for some tribes, but also at the same time as crime rose up exponentially throughout any country, right? And we all see evidence of that throughout Indian country. And those are the two major factors that have prompted the major issue of dismemberment that we see evidence of. And in the book, we've got several tables that we put together as carefully as we could, identifying some 80 tribal nations who are currently engaging in or have engaged in dismemberment policies. And we're combining denial of citizenship, disenrollment, and banishment in that. In California alone, 39 tribes have cast out, in some cases, great swaths of their community. The Chukchansi tribe has literally disenrolled more than one half of their nation. And Shelly's going to give several examples of peoples that we interviewed in the last couple of years as we were gearing up to do the book. But I want to read you the central question that we opened up with and that guided us as we moved into the study. As we wrote, a central question this book poses and attempts to answer is the following. What does it mean that the United States, a very large, heterogeneous, secular state, has in place laws and policies that protect its citizens' rights far more comprehensively than native nations, which are much smaller, more homogeneous, and ostensibly more kin-based polities? For if native nations are indeed communities of kinfolk that are ancestrally, culturally, psychologically, and territorially related, then it would appear that the grounds on which to sever or terminate such a fundamentally organic set of human relationships would have to be unequivocally clear and would in fact rarely be carried out, given the grave threat that such actions, the literal depopulation of the community's inhabitants, would pose to the continued existence of the nation. A corollary to the central question of the sanctity of U.S. citizenship in comparison to native citizenship is the following. What does it mean that the only class of citizens in the United States who cannot avail themselves of such sacrosanct rights are native individuals? Right? See, we pride ourselves in the country of being related, right? We hear the ubiquitous phrase from Sioux country, we are all related, and that we are. And yet we have become so cavalier in the way we take care of our own relatives that we are doing things now that would shame our ancestors. And Shelley will give you several examples of that momentarily. In 1978, when the Supreme Court handed down the Santa Clara decision, which Gabe will most likely also mention, the Supreme Court decided that a tribal nation did indeed have the right to deny citizenship to the children of a Santa Clara woman who had married a Navajo gentleman. All right? A gross denial of the civil and human rights of that family and those children, right? But tribes became emboldened by that decision. And that's the decision that many of them rely upon when they decide to kick out certain individuals. And then they use the term and the legal concept of sovereign immunity to say we can't be sued by our own people. We're exercising our sovereignty when we decide to cast out certain individuals, or in some cases, entire families of people. In the Nooksack case, over 306 individuals they're trying to terminate those individuals. So, as I said, I think the crime wave that erupted has generally led to banishment, right? And we heard somebody mention that yesterday. Gaming has generally led to disenrollment, right? And that's interesting, right? Disenrollment is the legal and political termination of a native citizen's rights, of their very identity, right? Banishment normally is simply a physical exclusion of a person, right? You take an individual and say, we no longer want you here, you're disruptive to our community, you're a drug dealer, or you're a actively involved person, or something else, and we want you away. And so we hereby tell you to leave our country and not come back until and unless you get your act together and get yourself rehabilitated, right? And so those are two very different forces, right? And that's where it's interesting when you compare what's happening in California with what's happening elsewhere. In California, most of the tribes are disenrolling. They're not banishing. They're literally disenrolling people. Throughout the rest of the country, in the 70 or 50-odd tribes outside of California that are dismembering individuals, in about half the cases, they're banishing individuals. And sometimes those individuals have a right to return home if they can pull things together. And what's interesting, too, about the concepts of disenrollment and banishment is that in some cases, and in many cases, we see that disenrollments are clearly politically and or economically motivated, right? And we know it, we have evidence of that, and we cite a lot of it in the book. In some cases, there are some tribes that engage in what they consider to be non-politically motivated dismemberment. And they believe that an individual maybe has been enrolled fraudulently, or maybe they haven't lived in the community long enough, and the tribal government, tribal officials feel that they have the right to tell individuals they've violated some key provision. But the bottom line is that historically, indigenous communities, since we were indeed families, extended families, right, of kinship-based polities, when there was a violation or when somebody violated a social norm or something, the idea was to find a way to restore balance, right? So you engage in mediation or restitution, or you use public ridicule or shaming. You didn't tell your relative, leave and never come back. Or we're telling you, you no longer belong. Right? And so that's what sort of guided us as we moved into the study. And we wanted to write this in such a way by interviewing disenrollees and those facing disenrollment, and by studying the legal literature and the court cases and the history of how the federal government itself has involved itself time and time again into our most intimate of internal affairs, deciding who belongs. So now I'm going to turn it over to Shirley and have her tell you some of the personal examples that we dealt with, and then I'll finish it up by laying out some ideas for reform that we lay out in the book.
I guess we talked to a lot of people who've been through this ordeal, and it sort of makes me think about why we chose the title that we chose. A lot of people think, they see the title and they think, oh, it's about serial killers, dismembered. But it actually conveys the feeling that these people shared with us. It's this deep grief. And when you think about the act of dismembering, it harms the piece that's cut off, and it ends up harming the body. And so we felt like this term really captured what this was doing to not just the individuals, but to the community. We talked to Carla Maslin in California. Her father had been instrumental in bringing their tribe back after it had been terminated. A lot of years he devoted his life to this tribe, to their health, to the health of the community. And they were back on their feet. They were recognized and starting economic development. A casino was being developed. He was their first chairman. Mm-hmm. But the political wind shifted, new people came into power, and they decided they wanted to disenroll him. There was a lot of jealousy, a lot of struggle for power. They asked the family to prove that they were actually members of this rancheria. So over the years, they amassed evidence of their lineage. People came before the council to talk to them, to talk about them on their behalf. Nothing was good enough. It got to the point where the council said, in order to do this, you have to give us DNA evidence that you belong with us. They actually asked Carla and her family to disinter her great-grandmother to prove that she was part of this tribe. And that wasn't good enough. They said, we also need your grandmother. And there was a lot of talk, a lot of pain in the family. Should we do this? But they'd been pushed so many years. The bar kept being reset and reset. So they decided they would do this. And they came forward and they presented their evidence. And they talked about how it hurt their hearts and how it was so hard for their family. And someone on the council actually said, well, what does it matter? She said, they're just bags of bones anyway. So it was this kind of heartless cutting off from the community. I mean, what we've all been talking about here, how we're all part of one another. There's reciprocity, there's kinship, we're part of the place. Like Shelly Vendiola was saying earlier this morning, place-based people. So they're saying, no, you don't belong. your ancestors are just bags of bones. This is all a business transaction. No matter what you do, you do not belong. So to this day, they don't have a good resolution. That's probably one of the saddest stories we came across, and Gabe's familiar with this. I mean, probably can add some things too. We also talked to Gene Sloan and his wife Alice. Gene had worked for many years for the Kato tribe, and he suspects that it was because he called some of the council's actions into question. He felt like there was a little bit of corruption going on, and he was promptly disenrolled and said that he didn't belong, that he was an enrollment error. His brother is still in the tribe, but not Gene. And it affects him. One of the things he talked about that really hurts him is he doesn't have the connection to the land that he used to. He can't go to the beach and dive for abalone like he was taught to as a child. They have to pay to have access to the beach. It's more restricted. He just doesn't feel, he feels like there's a barrier between himself and his place. Also, the Grand Ronde tribe that Gabe has worked with down in Oregon, they also went through posthumous disenrollment, whereby if you disenroll an ancestor, everybody after that is no longer in the tribe. It's pretty efficient. And with Gabe's help, they've fought back and are now in a more stable position. So there are just so many stories of heartbreak where you really feel like a body has been torn asunder.
Yeah, very good.
You want to read that quote? Yeah. Can you read it?
Okay. Yeah, I went to Australia last year for a conference and met an Aborigine scholar, Christina Black, and we had a long conversation because she had also studied and read a lot of work from Vine and was very taken with his brilliance and his ideas and so on. And I asked her about disenrollment, about dismemberment, about termination and whether or not that occurred in the Aboriginal community. She said, no, we would never do that to one of our own. And then when I got back, I wrote her about something else we had talked about, and then she sent me a statement through email. And here's what she said about why they don't do it in the Aborigine community. She said, that belonging was not just about belonging to a particular group of people, but also belonging to a particular landscape. And to be banished indefinitely from one's sacred landscape had an even more debilitating impact on the mind and spirit of the banished person. So this was something that even the offended community knew, that it ultimately did not have the spiritual authority to make a categorical decision on who belongs to country. As Aborigines say, because all were equally responsible in caring for one's homeland, even those who sometimes violated societal norms. See? And I think that's the kind of attitude that our ancestors once had, without question, without even thinking about it. There was just an understanding that I did not have the right to tell another Lumbee, hey, I no longer think you're a Lumbee, now that I'm in political power, right? Even if that individual had violated some law or some social norm. We found ways to resolve those differences amicably as best we could. And so as we did our case studies, in one of the chapters we have short vignettes of a number of tribes that have been involved in dismemberment policies. And frequently I get interviewed by people wanting to know, well, what's the smoking gun? Is it all about per cap? Is it all about money? Is it about race? What is it about? And I said, well, it's about all the above. It's about many things. And so in trying to summarize at the end of the chapter where we did all these vignettes of various indigenous case studies, I just want to read you some of the themes that sort of are common throughout many of these cases, although each case is absolutely unique, as Gabe will certainly verify momentarily. But here's what we came up with in terms of recurrent themes that we were able to discern after doing all this research. Number one, there were very few checks and balances in place in many Native governments that might have forestalled some of the problems that disenrollees face. Number two, nepotism, a practice in which office holders award positions, favor, and power to family members, a gnawing issue that has caused substantial problems throughout Indian country. Number 3, without any support, Native political elites in numerous cases created in their organic documents, whether it's a constitution or something else, a multitude of new doctrines, rules, regulations that are ever changing, thus depriving or dramatically minimizing those facing dismemberment of due process and a fair opportunity to challenge the charges that have been made against them. And Nooksack is a prime example of that, with the shenanigans that the 306 have gone through in trying to have their rights upheld. Number 4, as one Grand Ron elder put it, quote, "It's all about the money." So we do know that's there for sure. And this theme resonates in numerous, though certainly not all, cases. Number 5, tribal officials frequently use exaggerated and fabricated appeals to necessity, emergency, fear, and prejudice to justify the denial of fundamental human rights and constitutional traditional safeguards to those facing dismemberment. Number 6, race and geography also matter. In some cases, having the wrong ethnic ancestry, whether it be Filipino ancestry, Spanish ancestry, or African ancestry, in the case of some California Native nations, or African American ancestry in the case of Cherokees in Oklahoma, or Seminoles in Oklahoma, or living outside of what are considered the core or central homelands, seem to be sufficient grounds to deny or terminate tribal citizenship. Number 7, interfamily conflicts, sometimes dating back several generations, appear to be a leading factor in numerous cases. Number 8, the powerful role played by lawyers. Sorry, Gabe, but you're a good guy. You're a good lawyer who work for tribal governments and particular organizations like the California Indian Legal Services Entity, which was cited numerous times by several disenrollees from California-based Native nations. Lawyers were cited several times as being the culprits in crafting disenrollment policies, revising enrollment procedures to make it easier to disenroll, and in pursuing lawsuits that enrich law firm coffers while financially crippling those facing disenrollment. Right? So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Gabe.